Right, the last speaker actually today is Mark Jones, who's hiding behind my back somewhere. Mark Jones from Born Free Foundation, and he's going to speak to you now.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Wow, follow that. What an amazing set. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying. If you've just arrived, thank you for just arriving. It's great to see so many people coming through today celebrating Britain's amazing and wonderful wildlife. And isn't it great to see a bit of sunshine at the end of the day? That's really, really nice to see. My name's Mark. I'm a vet by training, and I'm really proud to work for the Born Free Foundation, which was founded more than 30 years ago by the actors Virginia McKenna and Bill Travers and their son Will Travers. And Will is at the Born Free stand, which is just more or less directly opposite me there, in the sunglasses. Go and speak to him. He's selling off merchandise at ridiculously low prices. I think it's £1 for anything on the table. So do go and have a chat to Will and buy some merchandise. Let's get all that stuff shifted. Virginia and Bill founded the charity following their experiences acting in the film Born Free. And the film told the story of the rehabilitation of an orphaned lion cub in Kenya called Elsa by the conservationists Joy and George Adamson. Now, it's 50 years ago this year since the film was released, so it's a big year for Born Free, it's a big year for our charity. And Will, our CEO and president, and chief seller on our stall, has already given you a flavour of the international work that we do, for which we're probably best known. However, while our roots were very firmly in Kenya, these days our work extends to protecting wildlife all over the world, including here in the UK. And I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what we're doing to try to improve wildlife protection here at home. As Will's already told you, Born Free's philosophy is one of compassionate conservation. But what does that mean? Well, we're a wildlife conservation organisation, and much of our work is about conserving wildlife populations and trying to reverse the alarming and in some cases precipitous declines facing many species around the world. But unlike a lot of conservation organisations, we're passionately committed to the welfare of individual animals. And we firmly believe that conservation isn't and can never be just a numbers game. We believe that every individual animal matters, and that the way we treat individual animals defines the kind of people and the kind of society that we are. Now, while the British government here has adopted a very proactive approach to combating wildlife trafficking at an international level, which is really good to see, here in the UK, decisions taken about the management of wildlife and the importance given to wildlife crime and persecution all too often fail to come close to what's needed, particularly when it comes to protecting animal welfare. And I'll give you a few examples. As you'll be very, very well aware, over the last 3 years, almost 4,000 badgers have been shot under licence in Gloucestershire, Somerset and Dorset in the name of controlling TB in cattle. The overwhelming majority of those badgers were perfectly healthy and posed no risk to anyone or anything. During the first year of those culls, the government appointed a panel of experts to look into whether they were effective and humane. The panel concluded that they were neither. But in spite of this, culling has continued with the support of the farming community, or parts of the farming community, and I'm ashamed to say, of many of my veterinary colleagues. And this year, Natural England is considering 29 new applications for culling licences in the west and southwest of England, which would collectively cover an area roughly the size of Yorkshire. Tens of thousands more badgers could be legally shot in the coming years. Now, no one denies that bovine TB is a big problem for the farming industry, but the rollout of this policy in the face of overwhelming scientific and public opposition is sheer madness and represents a complete disregard for the devastating impacts it's having on both targeted badgers and those that survive the culls, whose communities have been shattered, not to mention the impacts on the wider ecology. And Born Free is working hard with our partner organisations, many of whom are here today, to persuade government, farmers and vets to listen to the experts and think again on the badger cull. I'm sure many of you relish the chance to see seals and other marine wildlife when you visit the coast. I certainly do. Now, we're really lucky to have two types of seal, commons and greys, that call the UK home. But they're struggling around parts of our coasts, particularly common seals, which are thought to have declined by more than half in Shetland and Orkney, and by up to 90% in some other areas, such as the Firth of Tay, over the past decade. Yet, since 2011, over 1,500 seals have been legally shot by fish farmers and inshore fisheries in the name of protecting their fish stocks from predation by seals. Nursing mother seals aren't even protected, so in many cases, dependent pups are left to starve. Now, we're working hard in collaboration with industry, retailers, the Scottish Government, researchers and other animal protection groups to prevent the shooting of seals by finding safe, humane and effective methods of preventing seals from taking fish from fish farms or fishing nets. And thanks in part to these efforts, we've seen a 2/3 reduction in seals shot by fish farmers over the past 5 years. That's a really good start, but we need to go much further and reduce that number to 0, and to get government and industry to embrace the need to clean up their act and operate in a way that doesn't involve the massacre of wild animals. How many of you have been lucky enough to see wild hare recently? Anyone seen a wild hare? I see a few hands up. You're very, very lucky and fortunate to see these marvellous animals. They're a wonderful sight. But hare populations in the UK are struggling. Yet every year in England, literally hundreds of thousands of hares are shot in the name of sport. England and Wales are pretty much the only countries in Europe that don't ban the shooting of hares during their breeding season. Even Scotland has a ban from February to September to protect them when they're nursing young. And in England, most of the hare shooting takes place in February, right at the start of their breeding season. Now, the reason for this isn't anything to do with controlling populations or protecting crops or woodlands from supposed damage that hares might cause. It's purely and simply to give paying shooters something to shoot after the pheasant and partridge seasons end. And as a result, thousands of leverets, such young hares, are orphaned and left to starve when their mothers are shot. This results in massive animal suffering and makes no sense at all in terms of protecting those populations. Now, we at Born Free would of course like to see an end to all shooting for sport, but at the very least we need to see a closed season introduced to protect dependent young. So we're campaigning hard with the Hare Preservation Trust, who have a stand behind our own at the back there, and other partners, for England and Wales to come into line with the rest of Europe in order to secure the future and the welfare of our hares. Of course, it's not only free living wild animals that need our protection. Literally hundreds of thousands of wild animals, both native and exotic, are bought and sold to be kept as pets or used for public display in the UK, with terrible consequences for the welfare of many. The collection of animals for the exotic pet trade is also damaging the conservation of many species, and in some cases it ends up threatening our native wildlife through the establishment of breeding colonies from escaped non-native animals. And it also threatens the health and safety in many cases of domestic animals and people. Now, in the vast majority of cases, exotic pet keeping is unlicensed and uncontrolled in this country, so we don't even know what's out there. We don't even know the numbers. We don't know the full range of species that are being kept. So we're campaigning for much greater controls over the exotic pet trade in the UK and Europe to reduce the conservation and welfare impacts on the animals concerned. We've also been working to end the use of wild animals in travelling circuses since the 1990s, and we were finally promised legislation banning their use in England back in 2012, but we're still waiting for that legislation to be passed. And of course, Born Free continues its efforts to reduce the suffering of animals in zoos. Now, these are just a few examples of where our attitudes and our policies towards wildlife here in the UK need to be vastly improved. There are, of course, many others, and any one of the many animal protection groups represented here today could, I'm sure, come up with a long list of examples. Now, to improve the welfare and protection of free-living and captive wild animals, we need certain things to be in place. We need good legislation based on credible, independent evidence of the impacts of wild animal interventions or captivity. When we're considering interventions, we need to ensure that decisions fully account for the impacts on individual animal welfare as well as on populations and the wider ecology, and that a highly precautionary animal-focused approach is adopted. And we need strong law enforcement to ensure that wildlife crimes are given the priority that they deserve, and that sentencing acts as a real deterrent to wildlife criminals. Now, to this end, we campaigned alongside many others to ensure the National Wildlife Crime Unit, it's a police unit that specialises in wildlife crime, got the government funding it needed to continue its vital work. And it was really good to see that funding guaranteed for the next 4 years back in March. We're also working with the newly elected police and crime commissioners to make sure wildlife crime is a priority for police forces up and down the country, to ensure all wildlife crimes are made recordable, and to encourage the Crown Prosecution Service to ensure prosecutors understand wildlife crimes and get the specialist information and help they need to do an effective job bringing wildlife criminals in this country to justice. But if we're to persuade politicians and decision makers to change attitudes and ultimately legislation and policy, we need the voice of civil society to be heard. Britain, but somebody else has said this today, Britain is often described as a nation of animal lovers. Now that's sometimes hard to believe when you see some of the persecution of wild animals, both legal and illegal, that goes on within and around our shores. But I still believe passionately that the vast majority of people in the UK want to see our wild animals better protected. It's just that all too often their voice, your voice, isn't heard or it's ignored. Indeed, with the advent of the likes of the Lobbying Act, it feels like our government is trying to shut down our ability to campaign on behalf of animals altogether. We need to make sure our policymakers hear our voice loud and clear, and that the voice for our wild animals is never shut down or drowned out by vested interests. That's why events like this today are so important. That's why we need the Badger Army to continue the amazing series of marches and protests that have taken place to date across, I think, 35 or 36 towns and cities up and down the country. It's the biggest rolling wildlife campaign this country has seen for years, perhaps ever. I've spoken at a few of those events, and people sometimes say to me, well, what's the point? Nothing changes. But I believe that the marches, protests and gatherings like this really do make a difference, not just for badgers, but for all the wild animals we want to see better protected. It was civil society's voice that secured the much needed funding for the National Wildlife Crime Unit to continue its vital work helping bring British wildlife criminals to justice. And it will ultimately be civil society's voice that stops the inhumane and effective culling of badgers, the indiscriminate shooting of hares and seals, and the incarceration of wild animals in inhumane captive conditions, and all the other injustices that wild animals suffer. There are many issues that we as a society on which we draw a line in the sand. We don't tolerate child abuse. We don't tolerate racism or the persecution of minorities, and rightly so. And we shouldn't tolerate the persecution and suffering of wild animals or any animals just because those animals, through no fault of their own, happen to be in someone's way or happen to turn a profit for someone. We cannot allow politicians, civil servants and vested interests in industry to make decisions in darkened rooms that devastate our wildlife, or allow public money to be wasted destroying our natural heritage without being accountable to the wider public. And we cannot allow civil society's voice, our voice, to be silenced by ever-increasing legal restrictions on what we're allowed to say and how we're allowed to say it. So thank you once again for coming along to this amazing event today. Thank you to the organisers for inviting us and getting you all here and making it such a wonderful event to celebrate our wonderful wildlife. Enjoy what's left of the day. Please do all you can to continue to stick up for wildlife by joining the campaigns, supporting the local and national wildlife groups and charities, making your views known to your local and national political representatives, and persuading all of your friends and family to do the same. Together we can change things for the better. Thank you very much.